Germany, much like the United States, was a little late to the tank-making game. At the beginning of World War I, they did not see the need for tanks and thus didn't pursue them, opting instead for infantry, cavalry, and field guns. As time went on, the Germans were realizing that they were losing badly due to the tanks that the Allies had. So work began, and eventually they spit out the Sturmpanzerwagen A7V. This tank was nothing to be proud of, as it just didn't perform like the tanks of the Allies. It was designed similarly to an armored railcar that had its own engine and wasn't restricted to a track. It needed a massive crew of 18 to operate, and was like every other tank at the time. Big, boxy, and slow. Except worse. In fact, the German crews preferred to use the captured British tanks instead, because they were just generally overall better. Ultimately, only 20 of these vehicles were built, with all of them being scrapped after the war, except for one. Really, the only big thing that this tank has going for it is that it was involved in the first tank battle in history. Moving on, we know from World War II that the Germans were into designing crazy super heavy tanks, and that all began in World War I with the K-Wagon. This beast kind of looks similar to some of the British tanks of the time. It was originally supposed to weigh 165 short tons, which was heavier than the E100 for a weight comparison. The weight ultimately was reduced to 120 short tons later on, but still, that was a pretty massive vehicle for World War I. It was even a massive vehicle for World War II. It needed a crew of at least 22 people to operate. Ultimately, a lack of resources and the end of the war restricted production to only 2 almost complete prototypes. Now coming back to reality a little bit, the Germans came up with the LK-1, a prototype light tank. Germany realized that field artillery was more effective than heavy tanks at blowing things up, and that is why they became interested in light tanks. This tank was actually based off of a car. Instead of wheels, drive sprockets were put on for the tracks, and the thing was just covered in metal for armor protection. The sole purpose of this vehicle was to be a test for the LK-2, which followed right after. So not many of the LK-1s were made. So that leads us on to the LK-2. The LK-2 is very similar to the LK-1, except that it is a little heavier. 580 of them were ordered. Only 2 were made because, well, the war ended. The design ended up falling into the hands of Sweden, who used it to make their own tank in World War II. The last tank I'll be talking about today is the Sturmpanzerwagen assault tank. The Germans noticed that the French turreted tanks were performing well in combat, even more better than the British heavy tanks, so they wanted to make a French turreted tank too. So work began in the mid-1918, and it was supposed to be the FT-17 of Germany. It looked more like an early World War II tank than a World War I vehicle, and it would be smaller, more mobile than the A7V, but it never saw production since, well, the war came to an end again. So to wrap everything up, I'm going to talk a little bit about the German armored car. The Germans were getting tired of suffering losses from hit-and-run attacks by Belgium's armored car, so they decided to make one for themselves. 3 companies were told to come up with prototypes, and those companies did what they were supposed to, but they kind of forgot the fact that an armored car is supposed to be a car. What they ultimately came up with were bigger than tanks. The one I'm talking about, the Earnhardt EV4, weighed over 8 short tons, which was heavier than the FT-17 for weight comparison. This design was sent to the Western Front, where it failed miserably due to its weight, and then it was sent off to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians, where it saw a little more success, but really, it was a complete utter failure. But since it was a little more successful in the East, many more were ordered. After 2 years of testing, it was accepted into the German military in 1917. Learning from the testing phase, the weight of the vehicles were reduced by about 2 short tons to improve mobility. And after the war, these armored cars were used by police in Germany, where the vehicle really shined. It was very helpful in dealing with riots, as since it was so large, it put you way above the crowds. That's it for German early vehicles. Thanks for watching. See you guys later.